He spent his time in the workshop. He explained to Druot that he was trying to invent a formula for a new cologne. In reality, however, he was experimenting with scents of a very different sort. Although he had used it very sparingly, the perfume that he had mixed in Montpellier was slowly running out. He created a new one. But this time he was not content simply to imitate basic human odor by hastily tossing together some ingredients. He made it a matter of pride to acquire a personal odor, or better yet, a number of personal odors. First, he made an odor for inconspicuousness, a mousy workaday outfit of odors with the sour, cheesy smell of humankind still present, but only as if exuded into the outside world through a layer of linen and wool garments covering an old man's dry skin. Bearing this smell, he could move easily among people. The perfume was robust enough to establish the olfactory existence of a human being, but at the same time so discreet that it bothered no one. Using it, Grenouille was not actually present, and yet his presence was justified in the most modest sort of way, a bastard state that was very handy both in the Arnulfi household and on his occasional outings in the town. On certain occasions, to be sure, this modest scent proved inconvenient. When he had errands to run for Druot or wanted to buy his own civet or a few musk pods from a merchant, he might prove to be so perfectly inconspicuous that he was either ignored and no one waited on him, or was given the wrong item or forgotten while being waited on. For such occasions he had blended a somewhat more redolent, slightly sweaty perfume, one with a few olfactory edges and hooks, that lent him a coarser appearance and made people believe he was in hurry and on urgent business. He also had good success with a deceptive imitation of Druot's aura seminalis, which he learned to produce by impregnating a piece of oily linen with a paste of fresh duck eggs and fermented wheat flour, and used whenever he needed to arouse a certain amount of notice. Another perfume in his arsenal was a scent for arousing sympathy that proved effective with middle-aged and elderly women. It smelled of watery milk and fresh soft wood. The effect Grenouille created with it, even when he went out unshaved, scowling, and wrapped in a heavy coat, was of a poor, pale lad in a frayed jacket who simply had to be helped. Once they caught a whiff of him, the market women filled his pockets with nuts and dried pears because he seemed to them so hungry and helpless. And the butcher's wife, an implacably callous old hag if there ever was one, let him pick out for free smelly old scraps of meat and bone, for his odor of innocence touched her mother's heart. He then took these scraps, digested them directly in alcohol, and used them as the main component for an odor that he applied when he wanted to be avoided, and left completely alone. It surrounded him with a slightly nauseating aura, like the rancid breath of an old slattern's mouth when she awakens. It was so effective that even Druot, hardly a squeamish sort, would automatically turn aside and go in search of fresh air, without any clear knowledge, of course, of what had actually driven him away. And sprinkling a few drops of the repellent on the threshold of his cabin was enough to keep every intruder, human or animal, at a distance, protected by these various odors, which he changed like clothes as the situation demanded, and which permitted him to move undisturbed in the world of men and to keep his true nature from them. Grenouille devoted himself to his real passion, the subtle pursuit of scent. And because he had a great goal right under his nose and over a year still left to him, he not only went about the task with burning zeal, but he also systematically planned how to sharpen his weapons, polish his techniques, and gradually perfect his methods. He began where he had left off at Baldini's, with extracting the scent from inert objects: stone, metal, glass, wood, salt, water, air. What before had failed so miserably using the crude process of distillation succeeded now, thanks to the strong absorptive powers of oil. Grenouille took a brass doorknob, whose cool, musty, brawny smell he liked, and wrapped it in beef tallow for a few days. And sure enough, when he peeled off the tallow and examined it, it smelled quite clearly like the doorknob, though very faintly. And even after a lavage in alcohol, the odor was still there, infinitely delicate, distant, overshadowed by the vapor of the spirits, and in this world probably perceptible only to Grenouille's nose. but it was certainly there. And that meant, in principle at least, at his disposal. If he had 10,000 doorknobs and wrapped them in tallow for 1,000 days, he could produce a tiny drop of brass doorknob essence absolute strong enough for anyone to have the indisputable illusion of the original under his nose. He likewise succeeded with the porous, chalky dust from a stone he found in the olive grove before his cabin. He macerated it and extracted a dollop of stone pomade, whose infinitesimal odor gave him indescribable delight. He combined it with other odors taken from ale kinds of objects lying around his cabin, and painstakingly reproduced a miniature olfactory model of the olive grove behind the Franciscan cloister. Carrying it about with him bottled up in a tiny flagon, he could resurrect the grove whenever he felt like it. These were virtuoso odors, executed as wonderful little trifles that, of course, no one but he could admire or would ever take note of. He was enchanted by their meaningless perfection, and at no time in his life, either before or after, were there moments of such truly innocent happiness as in those days when he playfully and eagerly set about creating fragrant landscapes, still lifes, and studies of individual objects. For he soon moved on to living subjects. He hunted for winter flies, for maggots, rats, small cats, and drowned them in warm oil. At night he crept into stalls to drape cows, goats, and piglets for a few hours in cloth smeared with oil, or to wrap them in greasy bandages. Or he sneaked into sheepfolds and stealthily sheared a lamb and then washed the redolent wool in rectified spirit. At first the results were not very satisfactory, for in contrast to the patient things, doorknobs and stones, animals yielded up their odor only under protest. The pigs scraped off the bandages by rubbing against the posts of their sties. The sheep bleated when he approached them by night with a knife. The cows obstinately shook the greasy cloths from their udders. Some of the beetles that he caught gave off foully stinking secretions while he was trying to work with them, and the rats, probably out of fear, would shit in the olfactorily sensitive pomades. Unlike flowers, the animals he tried to macerate would not yield up their scent without complaints or with only a mute sigh. They fought desperately against death, absolutely did not want to be stirred under, but kicked and struggled, and in their fear of death created large quantities of sweat whose acidity ruined the warm oil. You could not, of course, do sound work under such conditions. The objects would have to be quieted down, and so suddenly that they would have no time to be quieted down, and so suddenly that they would have no time to become afraid or to resist. He would have to kill them. He first tried it with a puppy. He enticed it away from its mother with a piece of meat, all the way from the slaughterhouse to the laboratory, and as the animal panted excitedly and lunged joyfully for the meat in Grenouille's left hand, he gave one quick hard blow to the back of its head with a piece of wood he held in his right. Death descended on the puppy so suddenly that the expression of happiness was still on its mouth and in its eyes long after Grenouille had bedded it down in the impregnating room, on a grate between two greased plates, where it exuded its pure doggy scent, unadulterated by the sweat of fear. To be sure, one had to be careful. Carcasses, just as plucked blossoms, spoiled quickly, and so Grenouille stood guard over his victim for about 12 hours, until he noticed that the first wisps of carrion scent, not really unpleasant but adulterating nevertheless, rose up from the dog's body. He stopped the enfleurage at once, got rid of the carcass, and put the impregnated oil in a pot where he carefully rinsed it. He distilled the alcohol down to about a thimbleful and filled a tiny glass tube with these few remaining drops. The perfume smelled clearly of dog moist, fresh, tallowy, and a bit pungent. It smelled amazingly like dog. And when Grenouille let the old bitch at the slaughterhouse sniff at it, she broke out in yelps of joy and whimpered and would not take her nose out of the glass tube. Grenouille closed it up tight and put it in his pocket and bore it with him for a long time as a souvenir of his day of triumph, when for the first time he had succeeded in robbing a living creature of its aromatic soul. Then, very gradually and with utmost caution, he went to work on human beings. At first he stalked them from a safe distance with a wide meshed net, for he was less concerned with bagging large game than with testing his hunting methods. Disguised by his faint perfume for inconspicuousness, he minged with the evening's guests at the Quatre Dauphins Inn, and stuck tiny scraps of cloth drenched in oil and grease under the benches and tables and in hidden nooks. A few days later he collected them and put them to the test. And indeed, along with all sorts of kitchen odors, tobacco smoke, and wine smells, they exhaled a little human odor. But it remained very vague and masked, was more the suggestion of general exhalations than a personal odor. A similar mass aura, though purer and more sublimely sweaty, could be gleaned from the cathedral, where on December 24th Grenouille hung his experimental flags under the pews and gathered them in again on the 26th, after no less than 7 masses had been sat through just above them. A ghastly conglomerate of odor was reproduced on the impregnated swatches: anal sweat, menstrual blood, moist hollows of knees and clenched hands, mixed with the exhaled breath of thousands of him, singing an Ave Maria, mumbling throats and the oppressive fumes of incense and myrrh. A horrible concentration of nebulous, amorphous, nauseating odors, and yet unmistakably human. Grenouille garnered his first individual odor in the Hôpital de la Charité. He managed to pilfer sheets that were supposed to be burned because the journeyman sackmaker who had lain wrapped in them for 2 months had just died of consumption. The cloth was so drenched in the exudations of the sackmaker that it had absorbed them like an enfleurage paste and could be directly subjected to lavage. The result was eerie. Right under Grenouille's nose, the sackmaker rose olfactingly from the dead, ascending from the alcohol solution, hovering there, the phantom slightly distorted by the peculiar methods of reproduction and the countless miasmas of his disease, but perfectly recognizable in space as an olfactory personage. A small man of about 30, blond, with a bulbous nose, short limbs, flat, cheesy feet, swollen genitalia, choleric temperament, and a stale mouth odor. Not a handsome man, aromatically speaking, this sackmaker, not worth being held on to for any length of time like the puppy. And yet for one whole night Grenouille let the scent specter flutter about his cabin while he sniffed at him again and again, happy and deeply satisfied with the sense of power that he had won over the aura of another human being. He poured it out the next day. He tried one more experiment during these winter days. He discovered a deaf-mute beggar woman wandering through the town and paid her 1 franc to wear several different sets of rags, smeared with oils and fats against her naked skin. It turned out that lamb suet, pork lard, and beef tallow, rendered many times over, combined in a ratio of 2 to 5 to 3, with the addition of a small amount of virgin oil, was best for absorbing human odor. Grenouille let it go at that. He refrained from overpowering some whole live person and processing him or her perfumatorily. That sort of thing would have meant risks and would have resulted in no new knowledge. He knew he now was master of the techniques needed to rob a human of his or her scent, and he knew it was unnecessary to prove this fact anew. Indeed, human odor was of no importance to him whatever. He could imitate human odor quite well enough with surrogates. What he coveted was the odor of certain human beings, that is, those rare humans who inspire love. These were his victims. In January, the widow Arnulfi married her first journeyman, Dominique Drouot, who was thus promoted to maître gantier et parfumeur. There was a great banquet for the guild masters, and a more modest one for the journeyman. Madame bought a new mattress for her bed, which she now shared officially with Drouot, and took her gay finery from the armoire. Otherwise, everything remained as it was. She retained the fine old name of Arnulfi, and retained her fortune for herself, as well as the management of the finances and the keys to the cellar. Drouot fulfilled his sexual duties daily and refreshed himself afterwards with wine. And although he was now the one and only journeyman, Grenouille took care of most of the work at hand in return for the same small salary, frugal board, and cramped quarters. The year began with a yellow flood of caches, then hyacinths, violet petals, and narcotic narcissus. One Sunday in March, it was about a year now since his arrival in Grasse, Grenouille set out to see how things stood in the garden behind the wall at the other end of town. He was ready for the scent this time, knew more or less exactly what awaited him, and nevertheless, as he caught a whiff of it, at the Porte Neuve, no more than halfway to the spot beside the wall, his heart beat more loudly and he felt the blood in his veins tingle with pleasure. She was still there, the incomparably beautiful flower. She had survived the winter unblemished. Her sap was running. She was growing, expanding, driving forth the most exquisite ranks of buds. Her scent had grown stronger just as he had expected, without losing any of its delicacy. What a year before had been sprinkled and dappled about was now blended into a faint, smooth stream of scent that shimmered with 1,000 colors, and yet bound each color to it and did not break. And this stream, Grenouille recognized blissfully, was fed by a spring that grew ever fuller. Another year, just one more year, just 12 more months, and that spring would gush over and he could come to cap it and imprison the wild flow of its scent. He walked along the wall to the spot behind which he knew the garden was located. Although the girl was apparently not in the garden but in the house, in her room behind closed windows, her scent floated down to him like a steady, gentle breeze. Grenouille stood quite still. He was not intoxicated or dizzy as he had been the first time he had smelled it. He was filled with the happiness of a lover who has heard or seen his darling from afar and knows that he will bring her home within the year. It was really true. Grenouille, the solitary tick, the abomination. Grenouille, the monster who had never felt love and would never be able to inspire it, stood there beside the city wall of Grasse on that day in March, and loved and was profoundly happy in his love. True, he did not love another human being, certainly not the girl who lived in the house beyond the wall. He loved her scent, that alone, nothing else, and only inasmuch as it would one day be his alone. He would bring it home within the year, he swore it by his very life. And after this strange oath or betrothal, this promise of loyalty given to himself and to his future scent, he left the place light of heart and returned to town through the Porte du Cour. That night, as he lay in his cabin, he conjured up the memory of the scent. He could not resist the temptation, and immersed himself in it, caressed it, and let it caress him so near to it, as fabulously close as if he possessed it already in reality, his scent, his own scent. And he made love to it and to himself through it for an intoxicatingly, deliciously long time. He wanted this self, loved feeling to accompany him in his sleep. But at the very instant when he closed his eyes, in the moment of the single breath it takes to fall asleep, it deserted him, was suddenly gone, and in its place the room was filled with the cold, acrid smell of goat stall. Grenouille was terrified. What happens, he thought, if the scent, once I possess it, what happens if it runs out? It's not the same as it is in your memory, where all scents are indestructible. The real thing gets used up in this world. It's transient, and by the time it has been used up, the source I took it from will no longer exist. And I will be as naked as before and will have to get along with surrogates just like before. No, it will be even worse than before. For in the meantime I will have known it and possessed it, my own splendid scent, and I will not be able to forget it because I never forget a scent. And for the rest of my life I will feed on it in my memory, just as I was feeding right now from the premonition of what I will possess. What do I need it for at all? This was a most unpleasant thought for Grenouille. It frightened him beyond measure to think that once he did possess the scent that he did not yet possess, he must inevitably lose it. How long could he keep it? A few days, a few weeks, perhaps a whole month if he perfumed himself very sparingly with it. And then he saw himself shaking the last drops from the bottle, rinsing the flagon with alcohol so that the last little bit would not be lost. And then he saw, smelled, how his beloved scent would vanish in the air, irrevocably, forever. It would be like a long, slow death, a kind of suffocation in reverse, an agonizing, gradual self. evaporation into the wretched world. He felt chilled. He was overcome with a desire to abandon his plans, to walk out into the night and disappear. He would wander across the snow-covered mountains, not pausing to rest, hundreds of miles into the Auvergne, and there creep into his old cave and fall asleep and die. But he did not do it. He sat there and did not yield to his desire, although it was strong. He did not yield, because that desire was an old one of his, to run away and hide in a cave. He knew about that already. What he did not yet know was what it was like to possess a human scent as splendid as the scent of the girl behind the wall. And even knowing that to possess that scent he must pay the terrible price of losing it again, the very possession and the loss seemed to him more desirable than a prosaic renunciation of both. For he had renounced things all his life, but never once had he possessed and lost. Gradually the doubts receded, and with them the chill. He sensed how the warmth of his blood revitalized him, and how the will to do what he had intended to do again took possession of him. Even more powerfully than before, in fact, for that will no longer originated from simple lust, but equally from a well-considered decision. Grenouille the tick presented the choice between drying up inside himself or letting himself drop, had decided for the latter, knowing full well that this drop would be his last. He lay back on his makeshift bed, cozy in his straw, cozy under his blanket, and thought himself very heroic. Grenouille would not have been Grenouille, however, if he had long been content with a fatalist's heroic feelings. His will to survive and conquer was too tough, his nature too cunning, his spirit too crafty for that. Fine, he had decided to possess the scent of the girl behind the wall, and if he lost it again after a few weeks and died of the loss, that was fine too. But better yet would be not to die and still possess the scent, or at least to delay its loss as long as humanly possible. One simply had to preserve it better. One must subdue its evanescence without robbing it of its character, a problem of the perfumer's art. There are scents that linger for decades. A cupboard rubbed with musk, a piece of leather drenched with cinnamon oil, a glob of ambergris, a cedar chest. They all possess virtually eternal olfactory life, while other things, lime oil, bergamot, jonquil and tuberose extracts, and many floral scents, evaporate within a few hours if they are exposed to the air in a pure, unbound form. The perfumer counteracts this fatal circumstance by binding scents that are too volatile, by putting them in chains, so to speak, taming their urge for freedom. Though his art consists of leaving enough slack in the chains for the odor seemingly to preserve its freedom, even when it is tied so deftly that it cannot flee. Grenouille had once succeeded in performing this feat perfectly with some tuberose oil, whose ephemeral scent he had chained with tiny quantities of civet, vanilla, labdanum, and cypress. Only then did it truly come into its own. Why should not something similar be possible with the scent of this girl? Why should he have to waste this most precious and fragile of all scents in pure form? How crude, how extraordinarily unsophisticated. Did one leave diamonds uncut? Did one wear gold in nuggets around one's neck? Was he, Grenouille, a primitive pillager of scents like Drouot or these other macerators, distillers and blossom crushers? Or was he not rather the greatest perfumer in the world? He banged his fist against his brow. To think he had not realized this before. But of course this unique scent could not be used in a raw state. He must set it like the most precious gemstone. He must design a diadem of scent, and at its sublime acme, intertwined with the other scents and yet ruling over them, his scent would gleam. He would make a perfume using all the precepts of the art, and the scent of the girl behind the wall would be the very soul of it. As the adjuvants, as bass, tenor, and soprano, as zenith and as fixative, musk and civet, attar of roses or neroli were inappropriate. That was certain. For such a perfume, for a human perfume, he had need of other ingredients.